The document arrived at Charles's desk through a route that no one had planned. It was not delivered by a private secretary. It has not gone through the normal screening process that determines what comes to the king's attention and in what order. It arrived because a member of the royal household's financial staff made a decision that was outside of any established protocol. He went directly to the monarch, asked for a 5-minute private audience, and placed a single form on the table. The form had 3 pages. Charles read it standing up, standing next to the table where he had received it, without sitting down, which is a detail that the people who work around him describe as revealing when it happens. When Charles reads something standing up, it is because the information he is reading does not allow him the comfort of settling in normally. When he finished reading, he folded the pages in half, asked the employee to wait, and left the room for 10 minutes. When he returned, he told the employee that he had done the right thing by bringing him directly. He said the matter would be dealt with, and he asked that the employee not mention the document to anyone while the matter was being discussed. The employee agreed, but the existence of that conversation came to the attention of people who know the employee, in the way that information within a small, closed institution always eventually comes to the attention of people who shouldn't know it. And so it was that the story of that 5-minute encounter became the starting point for weeks of internal activity that no camera documented and no press release described. What was on the 3 pages was a summary of financial movements identified by the Royal Household's Financial Management Department during a routine compliance review. The review had been initiated 6 months earlier as part of a systems upgrade, the kind of process that happens periodically and that typically produces reports that go into a folder and never leave it. But that review had found something that the head of the department had judged to be significant enough not to fit into a folder. The movements identified did not, in the existing documentation, correspond to formal budget approvals. This, in itself, is not necessarily extraordinary. Complex financial systems sometimes produce discrepancies that have perfectly mundane explanations. But the movements in question had an additional characteristic that made them more difficult to explain. As the product of error or processing delay, they were consistent. They happened with a regularity that suggested a deliberate process, not an accidental irregularity. And they were all associated with the Queen Consort's office. Charles had read all 3 pages and had immediately understood what he was looking at and what it implied. He was a man who had managed complex estates for decades, who had presided over the Duchy of Cornwall for years before becoming king, who understood institutional finance with a precision that surprised people who expected to find a king merely a ceremonial representative. He knew what regular, consistent financial movements without documented approval mean when you find them in a compliance report. The 10 minutes he spent outside the room were, according to sources close to the king who learned of the episode later, the period in which he made the decision on how to proceed. It was not a period of shock or denial. It was a period of calculation. Who needed to know, in what order, in what form, and what needed to happen next for the situation to be addressed in a way that was not more destructive than the problem it was trying to remedy. The first step Charles took after letting the employee go was a phone call, not for Princess Anne, who was the person who later analysis of the case would identify as having played the biggest role in the ensuing investigation, not for William, who would be involved later. The first call was to the constitutional lawyer serving as the Crown's private consultant, a man who had advised the family on sensitive matters for over 15 years and whose discretion was beyond reasonable doubt. Charles described to the lawyer what he had read on the 3 pages, without showing the document and without naming the person whose office was associated with the movements. He asked the lawyer to explain to him what the correct procedure was when a sovereign received information of potential financial irregularity within the royal domicile but had not yet confirmed that the irregularity was real rather than apparent. The lawyer responded. The correct procedure, he said, was an independent audit conducted by a team external to the home, with a mandate clear and documented act producing a formal report that would go through defined channels before reaching the sovereign. This procedure existed precisely for situations in which initial information suggested a problem without confirming its existence, because a formal audit protected all parties involved. The household that was audited, the people within the household whose names might appear in the records, and the sovereign whose interest was that the issue be resolved based on facts and not preliminary information. Charles listened, thanked the lawyer, and asked that the matter remain strictly confidential until he determined the next step. The next step took 3 days to take. During these 3 days, Charles managed his usual schedule with the composure that had characterized his reign from the beginning, appearing at appointments, presiding over meetings, fulfilling the role of king without anything on the outside revealing what was happening internally. People around him described this period as one of the most impressive examples of compartmentalization they had observed in him, the ability to separate what was happening in one part of his life from the way it was functioning in other parts. On the 3rd day, Charles took the second step. He went to personally speak to Princess Anne. This choice revealed something important about how Charles had decided to approach the situation. Anne was the person within the family with the highest level of technical competence in matters of institutional supervision, with the greatest absence of conflict of interest in relation to the specific subject, and with the greatest ability to conduct a process of this nature without that process itself becoming a problem. Charles had come to the conclusion that if he needed someone to oversee what needed to happen next, Anne was that person. The conversation between Charles and Anne was described by sources who knew of its contents as the most direct the two brothers had had on any subject in recent years. Charles presented what he had received, described the movements the document identified, and told Anne that he needed a check that was rigorous enough to establish the facts with certainty, fast enough so that the uncertainty did not itself become a problem, and discreet enough so that the process did not produce public consequences before the facts were established. Anne listened. He asked some questions about the document, about the specific movements, about the period of time it covered. Then he told his brother that he could supervise what he needed, but that he needed him to understand clearly what supervision meant in this context. It meant that the outcome would be whatever the facts showed, regardless of what the facts showed. Charles said he understood. Anne said she needed him to say it again, explicitly, because she wanted to make sure she had been heard accurately. Charles said again, the result would be what the facts showed. This seemingly redundant exchange was actually the most important point of the conversation. Anne was establishing with Charles before assuming any responsibility that she would not conduct a process, the outcome of which could be influenced by personal or family considerations. If he took over supervision, the outcome would depend on the facts. If Charles was not prepared for this commitment, it was better for him to know sooner rather than later. Charles was prepared, and the fact that he was prepared revealed something about where he had arrived in those 3 days between the 3-page document and the conversation with Anne. He had processed the implications of what might be found, and he had come to the conclusion that living with uncertainty would be more destructive than living with clarity, regardless of what the clarity revealed. Anne hired an external audit team the next day. The choice of team was deliberate, not the office that had carried out previous audits of the royal household, not an office with any existing relationship with the Queen Consort's office, but a group of forensic auditors with experience of financial investigations in complex institutional environments who had no history with any of the parties involved. The team's neutrality was an essential part of its usefulness. The audit mandate was documented in 1.5 pages. Anne had drafted the mandate herself, with the same care she gave to any document that would be used as the basis for a consequential process. The mandate identified the period to be audited, the types of movements to be verified, and the nature of the expected report. It didn't name anyone. It identified a set of accounts and a set of review criteria. The audit took 5 weeks. Anne received updates from the team twice Z's per week. Each update was delivered in writing, in a format that could be archived and constituted a record of the process. This care with documentation was deliberate. Anne wanted every step of the process to be recorded in a way that made it impossible to question its integrity later. Charles received a weekly update from Anne, conveyed verbally in a conversation that typically lasted less than 10 minutes. It told him where the process was, without premature details about what was being found, because premature details could create pressure on the outcome before the outcome was established. Charles listened to each update, asked few questions, and did not ask for the process to be accelerated or for the criteria to be adjusted. He let Anne drive. In the 4th week of the audit, William was informed. The decision to inform William at that point, and not before, had been a joint decision by Charles and Anne made at the beginning of the process. William would be informed when there was sufficient material for the information to be useful, not before, to avoid being placed in a position of partial knowledge that could influence his ability to evaluate the full outcome objectively. When the audit team produced the first substantive results, Anne assessed that the point had been reached. William went to meet Anne to receive the initial briefing. She presented what the team had found so far sequentially, with the same attention to the level of certainty versus speculation that she had used with Charles. William processed the information with the focused attention that people who work with him describe as characteristic. He listens without interrupting, asks few questions during the presentation, and then goes through a period of silence before responding. Silence is not empty, it is processing. When he broke the silence, the first thing William said was a question about methodology. I wanted to understand how the team had reached the conclusions they had, not to question the team's competence, but to make sure they understood what the data could and could not establish with the confidence that the final report would need to support. Anne responded accurately. The team had managed to trace the origin of all identified movements to specific accounts within the system. It had managed to establish that none of the movements had any correspondence in formal budget approvals for the period in question. It had been able to determine that the movements were consistent over a period of time that made explanations of error or processing delay implausible. What the team had not been able to establish with the same certainty was the final destination of all the funds and the precise degree of direct involvement of the office holder in their authorization. William immediately identified that the second part of what Anne had described, the limitations of the audit, was where the situation became more complex to manage. A documented financial irregularity with clear sources and clear destinations is one thing. A documented irregularity with clear sources but partially untracked destinations is another. It is a situation that requires decisions about what to do with incomplete information, which is always more difficult than deciding based on complete information. He told Anne this. She agreed, and the two spent the next part of the conversation discussing what incomplete information could mean in different scenarios and how the final report should be structured so that it would be useful to whoever needed to use it regardless of which scenario turned out to be correct. The final report was given to Anne at the beginning of the 5th week. It was 53 pages long. She read it in full before transmitting any part to anyone else, a process that took the better part of a day. Then he scheduled a meeting with Charles and William for the following day. The meeting of the 3 brothers and heir with the king was the longest and most difficult of the entire process. Charles had prepared himself for her over the course of days, according to sources close to the king. He had arrived at the meeting with the determination to hear the full report before responding in any way, because he knew that his tendency to protect Camilla would be stronger immediately after hearing the conclusions than it would be after he had had time to process them. Anne presented the report with the same methodicality that had characterized the entire process. She was clear about what the report established with certainty, clear about what it established with reasonable confidence, and clear about what remained uncertain. It did not edit the conclusions towards any interpretation, presented what was there. The report confirmed the existence of irregular financial movements on a large scale. Material, it confirmed that these movements had occurred consistently over a 3-year period. It documented that there were no corresponding formal approvals for most of them, and it identified that the movements had passed through at least 3 points in the system that would normally have produced verification and approval, which suggested that some degree of deliberate configuration of the system had been necessary so that the movements could occur without triggering these controls. What the report was unable to establish with the same certainty was who had set up the system and whether there was direct instruction from the office holder or whether someone had acted based on their own interpretation of what was expected or desired. Charles heard everything. He didn't interrupt. When Anne finished, she was silent for a while. Then he said he wanted William and Anne to leave the room for 10 minutes while he reread the section of the report that described the movements in more detail. The 10 minutes became 20. When Charles asked them to return, there was something in his expression that sources close to the situation describe as different from what they had seen in him before. Not anguish and not anger, but a quality of determination that moves towards something difficult rather than trying to turn away from it. Charles said there were 3 things that needed to happen. The first was that the report would be archived appropriately as a formal record of an audit process conducted within established protocols, with all documentation supporting its conclusions preserved and accessible. The second was that the irregularities identified would be corrected, which required a review of the systems that had allowed them to occur and the implementation of controls to ensure they could not occur again. The third was that he needed to talk to Camilla. William said he agreed with all 3 things, in the order in which Charles had presented them, but that he wanted the third to be dealt with after the first 2 were underway, not before, because the outcome of the conversation with Camilla should not depend on what she said about having influence over the institutional steps that needed to be taken. Charles heard this observation and recognized it as correct. He said he agreed with the sequence. The systems review began that week. The audit team produced a set of recommendations on the controls that needed to be implemented, and the royal household's finance department began work on implementation. This process was technically complex, but institutionally relatively simple. There was a problem identified, there were clear recommendations on how to fix it, and there were resources available to do the work. The report archive was managed by Anne, who personally supervised the archiving process to ensure it was done in the way the material required, secure, documented, but accessible to anyone authorized to access it. She recorded the process in 2 pages of notes that she kept in her own personal files, not as a duplicate of the report, but as a record that the filing had been done. Charles' conversation with Camilla took place 10 days after the 3 met. The first stages of the systems review were underway. The file was complete, and Charles had had 10 days to prepare himself for a conversation he knew would be one of the most difficult he had had with the woman he had chosen. What happened in this conversation has no witnesses, and will not be fully known by anyone other than the 2 people who had it. What sources close to the king describe as having happened after her is what makes it possible to reconstruct its general contours. Charles did not come to the conversation with accusations. He had come to the conclusion, over the 10 days of preparation, that presenting Camilla with what the report had found as an accusation would be an error in judgment that would make the conversation impossible before it had begun. Instead, he presented what had been done and what had been found as facts, asked for her explanation, and waited to see what she would say. Camilla had learned, according to sources close to the situation, that an audit was underway. I had not known about the report or its conclusions before my conversation with Charles. What she knew had been enough for her to come into the conversation prepared to be honest about what she could be honest about, because she had come to the conclusion that any alternative to honesty would be worse. She was honest. What I told Charles did not completely resolve the ambiguity the report had left regarding the issue of direct instruction versus autonomous action by people within the office. But she was honest enough for Charles to walk away from the conversation with him, a picture of the situation that was more complete than that which the report had produced on its own. The picture he had after talking to Camilla was of a situation that had resulted from a combination of supervisory negligence on his part and actions taken by people within the office who had interpreted, rightly or wrongly, that certain things were desired. It wasn't the simplest image possible, but it was a picture that Charles found credible, and he found it credible because it was the picture that he had seen produce similar situations in large organizations where expectations are rarely articulated with the clarity that accountability systems presuppose. Charles went to William after having the conversation with Camilla, not to report the content of the conversation in detail, but to tell the son who had had the conversation, and his reading was that the situation, although serious, was within what the steps already initiated could adequately address. William listened to his father's assessment and said he agreed that the focus should remain on systems rather than people, because fixing the systems was what prevented the situation from happening again, regardless of what the full explanation was for how it happened. This convergence of positions between father and son, after weeks of a process that had involved enough tension to have produced divergence, was what allowed the situation to reach a closure that people around them both describe as functional without being easy. There was no clean resolution of issues of individual responsibility. There was a clear resolution of systemic issues, and there was a shared understanding that issues of individual responsibility belonged to the space of personal relationships within the family, where they would be managed by the time and quality of interactions that followed. Anne formally ended her oversight of the audit in a brief conversation with Charles, in which she conveyed to him that the last steps of the process had been completed and that the file was complete. Charles told him that he had done what needed to be done the way it needed to be done. Anne replied that she had done what was necessary because it was necessary, not because she had expected it to be easy. This distinction, simple as it is, captures something essential about how Anne operates. She doesn't operate expecting what she does to be easy for anyone involved. You act because you believe that certain things need to be done. And when they are done, she moves on without spending time analyzing the cost of what she did or waiting for the cost to be recognized. What caught the attention of people around this whole situation was not just the process itself. It was how each of the people involved behaved throughout it in ways that were different from what previous history with each of them might have led one to anticipate. Charles had surprised because he had separated what he felt as a husband from what he understood as a king more completely than those around him had expected him to achieve. This behavior was not the product of coldness towards Camilla. It was the product of an understanding that had matured in him over the years of reign, that the monarchy he had waited his entire life to lead had requirements that could not be negotiated for affection. William had surprised because he had exerted an influence on the process that was both real and invisible. Real because the questions he asked, the analyses he offered, and the principles he articulated in conversation with Charles and Anne had shaped how the process was conducted. Invisible because he had done all this without ever crossing the line between supporting the process and taking control over it. This distinction, between influencing and controlling is one of the most difficult to maintain when you are in the position of heir apparent in a situation that has direct implications for what you will inherit. Anne had surprised because she had conducted a 53-page process that produced a result that no one was completely happy to have found, and had done so without the process itself having produced collateral damage greater than the problem it was trying to address. This result, rigorous process without unnecessary destruction, is more difficult to achieve than it seems when described in abstract terms. It requires a combination of technical competence, judgment about what is necessary versus what is sufficient, and a willingness to stop when the work is done rather than continuing beyond the point where continuation serves the investigation and not the investigator. Camilla had surprised her because she had been honest when honesty would have been more difficult than the alternative. This honesty hadn't solved everything. He had created conditions so that what needed to be resolved could be resolved in a way that preserved what the family needed to be preserved. And the family was surprised because it had worked imperfectly, with enough tension that no one involved found the process comfortable, but in a way that produced the result that a family and an institution need to produce when they have to address internal integrity problems without that addressing destroying what the integrity was meant to protect. This is not a result that happens by accident. It is the product of people who, each in their own way, understood that the cost of not addressing the problem would be greater than the cost of addressing it. And they acted in accordance with that understanding, even when acting was more difficult than not acting. The 3-page document that arrived on Charles's desk in a way no one had planned began a 5-week process that produced a 53-page report and a series of systemic changes that made the Queen Consort's household more accountable than it had been before. None of these documents are public. None of the steps that produced these documents were announced. The outside world saw the British royal family continue to function during the 5-week process exactly the way the British royal family functions. Commitments kept, appearances kept, the surface that the monarchy needs to keep functioning regardless of what is happening beneath it. What was happening beneath her during those 5 weeks was a king facing something difficult, a princess conducting a rigorous process, an heir exerting influence with precision, and a queen consort coming to honesty in a conversation that could have gone another way. This is also how the British monarchy works, not just in the ceremonies and speeches and engagements that cameras document. In private conversations, in discreet processes, in decisions made in rooms without an audience that determine whether the institution will be able to continue being what it needs to be. Charles had been confronted with the rumors. What happened next had caught the attention of everyone who was watching him closely, the attention of those who expected that he would not be able to separate what he felt as a husband from what he understood as a king, and had been surprised to discover that he could. To fully understand what made Charles's reaction so surprising to those around him, it is necessary to look at the pattern that had preceded this moment. Over the decades, in situations involving Camilla and the tension between protecting her and doing what the monarchy demanded, Charles had chosen protection often enough that this standard had become an expectation. It was not an expectation based on ill will or negative judgment. It was simply what decades of observing how he operated when under pressure in relation to his wife had produced, a collective reading that the affection he felt for Camilla would act as a buffer between the evidence of a problem and the willingness to act in response to it. What happened in those 5 weeks showed that this reading was incomplete. She was not wrong in the sense that the affection was less than what had been projected onto him. It was incomplete in the sense that there was something happening in Charles that had changed the way affect and institutional judgment interacted when they were in conflict territory. Those around the king identify this something as the product of two factors that had converged in the period before the 3-page document. The first was the kingship itself, assuming the throne had given Charles a clarity about institutional responsibility that, being Prince of Wales, for all the seriousness he had taken to that position, had not been able to fully replicate. Being the monarch means that the consequences of your decisions, or your failure to make decisions, fall on the institution in a way that doesn't allow for the kind of hesitation that was easier to sustain when there was someone above you in the chain of authority. The second factor was illness. Managing a serious medical condition while fulfilling the responsibilities of head of state creates a particular form of clarity about what is essential. People who go through experiences of this nature often describe a simplification of what seems important, not because small things disappear, but because big things become larger in proportion. For Charles, what had loomed large was the question of what kind of monarch he would be in his remaining years. And part of the answer to that question involved the ability to do what needed to be done, even when doing what needed to be done was personally costly. This combination of factors, reign and illness, was what those around Charles identified as they are left as having produced the separation that surprised. It wasn't a decision to love Camilla less. It was a decision, or perhaps a discovery, that loving her the way she deserved to be loved didn't require protecting her from the consequences of problems that needed to be addressed. The distinction seems simple when articulated. It is extremely difficult to maintain when the person in front of you is the person you love, Charles had maintained. And the fact that he did change something about the way people who watched him closely thought about the kind of king he was being. William had observed his father's behavior throughout the process with the attention he pays to everything that has implications for what he will inherit. Not just the structures and systems and formal responsibilities, but the forms of behavior that the monarchy produces in the people who operate within it, and that he himself will need to develop. What he had observed in his father during those 5 weeks was what he had hoped to see in his father for years: the ability to treat the institution as a responsibility that transcends personal relationships without having to treat personal relationships as less important. Anne had observed the same and had named what she observed in a direct way that is characteristic of her. I told William, in a conversation after the proceedings were over, that I had seen something in those weeks that I hadn't seen often enough over the years I had been at his brother's side: a willingness to sit with a difficult truth without trying to rewrite it into something more comfortable before deciding what to do with it. This willingness to sit with a difficult truth without trying to rewrite it is what determines whether a person with power can use it in a way that serves what the power is supposed to serve. It's easy to do in theory. It's hard to hold when the hard truth is about someone you depend on, someone you care for, whose presence in your life is part of what makes life bearable in the midst of everything that's demanded of it. Charles had maintained, William had watched, Anne had named, and the British monarchy had produced, in those 5 weeks, a version of itself that is not often visible, but which is the version that justifies the claim that it is capable of learning. The 3-page document that arrived on Charles's desk in a way no one had planned was now part of a 53-page file in compliance with all established protocols, accompanied by Anne's notes on the archiving process, preserved in a form that would be available to anyone with authority to access it in the future. The family had faced something difficult. It had produced a result that no one had found easy, and it had moved on. Because moving on is what families within institutions need to do when the work of addressing a problem is done, and the work of remaining the family they are begins again. Camilla remained queen consort. Irregularities had been documented and systems had been patched. Charles had separated what he felt from what he understood. William had watched and learned. Anne had driven and closed. And the official who had taken the 3-page document directly to the king, deviating from the established protocol because he had judged that what he had was too important to fit into a normal process, had done the right thing. Charles had told him that. And the fact that Charles had realized this the very afternoon he had read the 3 pages, before he had resolved anything else, before he had spoken to anyone else, was perhaps the most telling detail of all. A king who recognizes, at the moment he receives difficult information, that the person who brought it was courageous in doing so, is a king who is available to receive difficult information in the future. And this availability is what determines whether the information that needs to reach the top of organizations actually gets there, or whether it gets trapped in layers of protection that serve the people in the middle but don't serve anyone who is actually trying to make the institution work. Charles had become available, and it had surprised people who knew him well enough to know how much it had cost.